All right, what's up, guys? This is episode 16 of Off Bishop Street Podcast 2.0, the relaunch. I have the pleasure of receiving today Dr. Andre Furlani, who we've been discussing here and there about different things off the record. So it's quite interesting to have folks that are in peripheral fields. Theology is a very versatile field. It connects with literary studies, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, psychology, philosophy. So, a plethora of different specialties, and I'm trying to have guests that are remotely related or just deeply related into the theological field. Come on over on the podcast, and this is episode 16 already. We started this podcast back in, or restarted it back in late March 2023, and now 16 episodes later, we're having a good time. So, Professor Furlani, how's it going today?
Very, very well. I'm delighted to be in the theology department, and I've been sometimes in the religion department. And when I was chair, indeed, I was quite involved for more administrative reasons with religious studies, or what was then called religious studies, because there's been a name change and a reminder that though we think of theology and religion as bedrock certainly in humanist studies, of course, you have this peculiar split, which wasn't obvious to me growing up. And then you have the kind of transmogrification of religious studies, and all of these are, of course, symptomatic of tendencies that are less urgently registered in the more secular literary fields of the humanities, or philosophy for that matter, or art history, which is to say,
there we go. Yeah.
Which is to say, what are a set of different paradigms to contemplate, resist, welcome, foster, alter in, say, literary studies is a matter of doctrinal rupture,
right,
at the level of theology, religious studies, which, in fact, to me is something of an attraction.
Mm-hmm.
That the stakes are probably in the larger sense the same, but they're felt more immediately. Just again, the split between theology and religious studies. What is that? Theology has God in the name.
Right.
The science of God.
Right.
Talking about God.
Right.
Is really what it means. Making sense of, or with, or for, by means of God. Is really what the Greek word, and the Greek is a very powerful term, as is often the Greek theological term. Well, all the philosophical terms tend to be, but and religion is about community organization. It comes from a Latin word, right? Just meaning to bound up. What actually connects a group into what in theological terms would be a laity. What is that? And that has become a significant split,
right,
felt at the university itself. Whereas in literary studies, it's more like, is literature, philosophy, art history, are these kind of superior, almost ahistorical fields of a kind of higher or fixed or immutable, potentially immutable knowledge compared to history, or really is it just a set of discourses, and there's no particular privilege to poetry. Religious studies is scripture privileged.
Right.
That is a much more urgent problem. Suddenly, what is the status of the Bible? And as I was saying before you began to record, Christopher, being raised a Catholic, the Bible was really a tertiary consideration. The important element was the religio.
Right.
What binds you.
The tradition, mostly.
What binds you is, the liturgy,
right,
certainly. Devotional practices, the everyday habits, sanctions, permissions, and possibilities of a community And so where the Bishop of Rome, the Pope is really the authority,
Right.
and not the Bible. And of course, once you read the Bible, you see why that isn't just a kind of obscurantism of the Catholic Church, because the Bible is a library. It's
Absolutely.
not
Yeah.
a book. The Greek word means little parchment
Right.
rolls.
Like in French, they have the word bibliothèque, which basically, there's the word Bible in bibliothèque, right?
Yeah. So you
Um,
have there
yeah.
the
Biblios, perhaps in Greek. Yeah.
yeah, oh yeah. Well, it's a papyrus roll.
Right.
That's a biblos is a papyrus roll. So a bunch of papyrus rolls, and 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 from the beginning of anything like a written tradition in the Christian and Jewish traditions that preceded and parallel it, you immediately have all of these problems once you get into what basically becomes kind of literary studies.
Right. Yeah.
Like, well, why is man created twice in Genesis? Why does God create light on the first day, but the sun on the fourth? What's going on? So suddenly it's kind of you're in a humanist area where you're looking at what are the sources for the text, whereas in Catholicism I was raised in the Bible was written by people, but the Pope ex cathedra speaks on behalf of the divine,
Right.
and so these literary considerations are secondary to the life of the church, and as we were saying earlier, like kind of almost a difference between theology and religion. Theology, the logos, of course, leaving aside its rich etymology, we know as to mean the word. Uh, in the beginning was the word.
Right.
Energete, logos.
Right.
Okay, boom, got it. It's logos. It actually means to gather things together. That's what the Greek. It's a middle verb. It means to gather up any object, anything, and in a sense to create a kind of inventory or a prioritization, a ranking,
Right.
and so when you're doing that, you're involved in a kind of a human situation. Whereas religio is like, the sanction doesn't come from that at all. But once I started looking at the Bible to figure out what Protestantism is about, obviously Martin Luther,
Right.
Luther translated the Bible.
That's right. Yeah.
Why does the Protestant Reformation begin with translating a Bible? So why would that be so provocative? It's not like the church was unaware of what was written in Jerome's translation of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament, right? But of course, that's where Protestantism begins. It's like let's pay some attention to what is actually stated here rather than
Right.
what is stated in Rome.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, being raised in North America, but from an Italian and German Catholic family, that kind of rupture between religio and theologia, you can I've kind of lived it a bit, like, oh yeah, I see that split. And it's pronounced, it's profound, it's complicating, so I kind of like being around theological and debates in theology and religious studies because they tend to render urgent what in the secular humanities, or the more secular humanities, is often, as I said earlier, just a set of paradigms up for grabs for discussion.
Yeah.
Where it's more like, how am I to practice an ethical life, for instance, is an unavoidable consequence of theological determinations,
Right. And just to intertwine that with a couple of the, moving parts that we talked about before going on record, like it's interesting how postmodernism, and that's 100% my perspective on it, how it opened the gateway for better or for worse. Because when you look at what, consequentially, philosophically, and societally happened, well, you notice how people, are much more flexible with their drafting of what exactly an ethical lifestyle is, or whereas, when you go back 50, 60, 70 years ago, religion, especially Christianity in the West, was pretty much the anchoring point, whether it be Catholicism or Protestantism. I have happened to grow up in a Catholic family myself, but with time, just going to evangelical services, I still go to evangelical services. I'm more of an overarching Christian now, and I say that over and over again. But I've always had, the Christian religion as my reference point to, knowing not only just through systematic theology, but just, understanding what biblical teachings entail for me to, live out a proper life. You mentioned the 10 Commandments. I try to abide to those, not lying, not stealing, not killing. And, but yeah, nowadays, like, it seems to me that, with that expansion of personal liberty and freedom and individualism, at the same time, you have this massive drawback where people are actually lost in the jungle and they don't necessarily know what to believe in or how to act, or what exactly, like, ethics has become so relative, just not only not only by what we hear on the news, but just in general with how people act. Because if morality becomes a relative thing, that it may have its pros and cons, but it does pose a lot of danger. When it becomes super light, and just the fact that one of your areas of expertise was indeed like postmodernism, that really grasped my attention, because before starting my MA, years before, like now I'm wrapping up my MA, but years before, like postmodernism was something that within the Catholic framework I was really wrestling with to understand, well, what exactly does that involve in society, and given that you've done literary studies as well and you specialize in that, like how it influenced literature in a sense.
Yeah, and how it's influenced religious studies. But postmodernism, to quote the Bible, is a house with many mansions. And indeed, I think part of the reason why it can become a straw man is because there is no such creature. There's just a set of family resemblances of ideas that sometimes can crystallize profitably under the rubric of postmodernism. It is striking, of course, that terms like modernism and postmodernism actually were borrowed, not from literary studies, but from theology. So, modernismo in Catholicism, for instance, was about liberal reforms within the church. That's where that word actually began to be used. I was hired to the Department of English here at Concordia as a authority, so-called, of course. I mean, it's risible, but an authority in modernism. So I would undertake these courses. And then they said, well, Andre, you do modernism, so you must know something about postmodernism. And indeed, at the time I thought, yeah, I know this and that and the other, and I can learn more. And I also live in a society that I'm told is postmodern to begin with. So I'm apparently breathing this air, but the term postmodernism begins in Latin American Catholic circles to describe a second wave of liberal and challenges to the reactionary elements, perceived reactionary elements in the Catholic Church, and thinking about it, especially in Latin America, with reference to liberation theology,
right? Yeah.
More political engagement, which of course the papacy determined to staunch. So I was working in fields which already had something of a whiff of theology, though most of the people who talked about modernism and postmodernism were unaware of the fact. So there's that feature to begin with, striking that some of the basic concepts really are coming out of the urgency of these issues for religious communities. So it makes a lot of sense. And it goes back to what I was saying about the attractiveness sometimes of seeing problematic in the context of theology, because it's not merely a free-for-all. It's not just a seminar table, with a lot of views.
Right.
It's like, okay, but when we leave this room, what am I to do?
Right.
So you have that. And postmodernism, in the wider sphere, with which we're probably most familiar with it, I remind my students in some respects, then becomes, well, I should say modernism becomes a kind of back formation from postmodernism.
Right.
Because in the 60s, all kinds of elements that were fascinated by early 20th century avant-garde movements in theology as well as in philosophy, literature, they're attracted to them. They never called themselves modernists in the secular field. The term was very rarely used. But these various cliques recognized a sort of pedigree. They all agreed that these were important to them. Surrealism, Dadaism, Futurismo, all the Ulysses, Virginia Woolf, and so they started using the word modernism a lot because in a sense they were calling themselves postmodern. So they had to have a modernism crystallize around them. So we're reminded too that these terms belong to historical moments. They reflect certain kinds of debates that often are forgotten 20 years later, but which at the time were fundamental in crystallizing these rubrics. And then in the case of postmodernism, it shifted significantly. It became a very demotic term, a term describing popular culture.
Yeah.
Whereas the first version of it was actually quite elitist. It was based on a kind of dedication to very high cultural norms, aptitudes, ideals. So say the literary avant-garde of Europe. So literature is often very difficult to read. The Wasteland of T.S. Eliot, the Cantos of Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein's work, for which there's not even a term sometimes to describe what she does, Finnegan's Wake, and it became increasingly, however, demotic by the 70s, the 80s, 90s. So in a way, you see how that term too really floats. But you mentioned like the relativism with which it's associated. And I'd say that the consequence of postmodernism is just not that it makes ethics a domain of mere relativism, but that it compels our ethics to pay attention to conflicting standards and attitudes, principles of ethical action. We can no longer simply blissfully disregard or call barbarism the beliefs of others. And that has an old history. One of the great postmodern books was written in the 5th century BC. Herodotus' The Histories, the first book extant to survive. There were some precursors that did history, But history, when Herodotus used the term, it's the opening line of the book. Of course, it didn't have a title. It says, these are the histories of Herodotus, of Halicarnassus, in which, then he goes on to summarize the book.
Right.
But the word history there, or it's translated history, actually means inquiry.
Oh, okay.
History in Greek is to inquire. Right? Different term.
It's a totally different meaning, yeah.
It's completely different. We don't know what happened.
Right.
But we're going to inquire into it. And we only inquire into it because we're not sure that the reports we get of it are quite accurate.
Right.
And of course, it's about the Persian War. It's about coming face to face with a much greater, much more developed culture at the time that invaded Greece.
Mm-hmm.
Greece was kind of like Afghanistan when it was occupied by the Soviets, the British, the Americans, and like that, like Afghanistan, actually, remarkably retarded the advance of an imperial power. And Herodotus right away starts relativizing, saying, well, you know what, the Scythians, the Persians, don't do what the Athenians do, and their religious practices are different. And actually, the Athenian practices are different from those of Corinth. Why do we never remark on that? Right. The Spartans have a completely different way of organizing their society, but they're only a boat ride away from us here, from Attica on the Peloponnesus. So you have already in the foundational document of history a kind of postmodern fascination with the Egyptians were a much more advanced society than
That's
ours.
right. Yeah.
And look at their beliefs and practices and the kind of culture they devised, which is nothing like our own. So, so that's what we want from, I guess, a kind of a theological postmodernism, a set of tools for a responsible encounter, not only with our own personal existential practices, but with those of groups which do not share our communion.
That's right.
To put in Catholic terms, for whom the idea of eating the body and blood of God is a deeply offensive profanity. I mean, think of what that means for Semitic monotheism, Judaism, Islam. I mean, it's just the last word in barbarism.
Right.
And suddenly, when you look at your beliefs from outside, you have a chance to inquire into, like Herodotus, into what it is I believe. And I'll give you a short anecdote about that reminds me of this kind of postmodern relativism. So I was. I'm wearing the wedding band of my wife Mechthild Bauschen, who died of cancer 21 years ago.
Is it your wife, basically?
My wife, my first
sorry
wife,
to hear that.
Mechthild.
My condolences.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a daily force. In any event, my wife Mechthild was raised Catholic in Cologne, which in fact it was Ratzinger's diocese bishop, and Cardinal Ratzinger, before he became Pope. So it's a very Catholic town surrounded by Protestant communities. And my father-in-law, Rudolf Bauschen, he ran a school for the deaf. He'd survived the Nazi regime as a child, had a lot of insight into totalitarianism, I can tell you.
Right.
And hard-won liberalism in that man. And he'd also been raised Catholic and had an intellectual interest as well as a moral commitment to the tenets of his faith. And so, he had like the patristic fathers in his library in German translation. I was really struck by that. Wow. And many books on Protestant theology, belief, and practice, which is invariable in Germany because Protestantism is so dominant in much of Germany, outside the south, Bavaria, and places like Cologne and a few other dioceses. Anyway, we arranged to be wed in the city where they lived at the time, Münster, where he ran the school for the deaf, my father-in-law. And so we prepared for the service. And being raised a Catholic, we knew what exactly to expect and how to do it and whatnot. But I had a discussion with my father-in-law. I said, I've been sufficiently infected by Protestantism to have a lot of apprehensions about a blasphemous communion, since the sacrament. I said, I take a Protestant view of the sacrament, frankly. Once I learned what is entailed in this most important sacrament of the church.
Mm-hmm. The transubstantiation, the Eucharist.
The Eucharist, thank you. The Eucharistifeier, the feast of the Eucharist, say in German. And Eucharist is such a beautiful word. It means rejoice.
Right, yeah.
The rejoicing. So I knew some of that, and he knew a lot about that. So we would have many discussions about religion. I learned a lot about theology from him and from his library. And I knew, he was a practicing Catholic. Still, I said, I'm not sure I can get up in front of my own family, your family, the family I'm entering in the church, before the priest and before the Catholic God, and to participate, celebrate communion where I have these reservations. And he said, nobody believes that. Just dismissed it. He said, oh, the whole sacramental theology is a recent phenomenon. He directed me to books. He felt it was a wayward kind of deviation of Catholic theology in the face of Protestantism,
Mm-hmm.
and that of course it's not. Of course it's a commemoration of the Paschal Feast,
Right.
and the remembrance of our Lord. And I was completely flabbergasted. Boy, here's a practicing Catholic who knows whereof he practices
Right.
and speaks, dismissing what I thought as the fundamental of Catholicism, especially in contraposition to the Protestant that surrounded us. So I said, this wedding was actually in Münster. The family was from Cologne. Münster is a very Protestant city. In other words, Catholics really, they're surrounded, by sectarian tensions, if you
Right.
like. There, it was a gorgeous 13th century Romanesque church. The feast was magnificent, and I of course participated, celebrated communion from this point of view. So what happened there? So from a postmodern point of view, I was being told, look, these are relative viewpoints, these are paradigms that can be interpreted differently, that must be taken in their historical context, and maybe rectified or illuminated by what that community is doing at that time, what it shares, what it understands, what it values most, and not these theological disputes,
Right.
which may or may not impinge on those practices. So there's postmodernism. I said, again, postmodernism is a term that comes out of church thinking and then gets transposed into secular thought. And there I was experiencing it. I was having my postmodern encounter precisely within this sacral, devotional setting, where the stakes were so high.
Yeah.
So even though I had my doubts about Catholic practice, I certainly did not wish to be irreverent in the literal sense of the word, impious, to mock the Mass on the most important day of my life, the most important act of my life,
Mm-hmm.
and the foundational moment of my union with my very beloved wife, Mechtel. So it crystallized those problems, and it also showed that postmodernism need not be some sort of again what I was just earlier calling a straw man to polarize a debate. It isn't a way of casting doubt.
Right.
It's a way of seeing deeply into what we value. And I'll quote, or I'll paraphrase. We were talking about him prior to the recording beginning. Paraphrase a remark by Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher. Anglo-Austrian, studied much of his philosophy at Cambridge and a bit at Cornell in the United States, but that's not the story. Wittgenstein, who has been very important to postmodern conceptualizations of religious practice and belief and doctrine, when he was dying of cancer, wrote a short, magnificent book, Über Gewissheit, on certainty. And Wittgenstein was reverent. He took religious conviction very, very seriously.
Was he Jewish? Was he?
His family was originally Jewish.
Right. From the last name you can tell.
Converted.
Right.
And he had not studied scripture in Hebrew. He did not speak Yiddish, like many Jewish communities in Central Europe, of course. In his period, he was from a very assimilated family of extremely wealthy industrialists. And he was famous for being a kind of a tzaddik, a kind of holy, kind of a Jewish holy man, he renounced all his wealth, for instance.
Right.
Not a penny did he take when he became a billionaire at the death of his father. Gave it back to his family and said, I could give it to the needy, but money just does harm. He really believed that money was the root of all evil. And he said, I'm going to give it to my brothers and sisters because they already have so much, it can't do them more harm. They're already so harmed. That's his view. Okay? So is Wittgenstein. He's dying of cancer perfectly placidly, perfectly accepts it, no qualms about it at all.
No chemotherapy.
He was obliged to do, it wasn't chemotherapy at the time, his doctor with whom he lived, he was a real Zadik. He didn't even have a residence in the last years of his life. Doctor took him in at Oxford, in fact, though he's a Cambridge philosopher. And there was a treatment, and he felt he had a moral obligation to be treated. There was treatment, he should submit to it. But and it went into remission and then recurred. When it recurred, he was told by the doctor, Dr. Bevan, that he would not, that it was not terminal. And Wittgenstein famously said to him, as recorded by Bevan's wife, good. He wanted that settled. I want this kind of dealing with it. He knew quite a bit about medicine. I won't go into the reasons why. And but he had, as I say, this kind of holy man attitude to things. Like, this is my span. It's ending. And he had a wonderful period. He had a kind of an intellectual honeymoon because he had no distractions at that point. And he wrote this book on certainty. Now, that's a subject you want to think about at the end of your life.
Right.
What do we know for sure?
Yeah.
The man who wrote the Tractatus and the Philosophical Investigations, two works which seem to have incompatible views of certainty.
Which doesn't surprise me because, if he was an engineer in a previous life, that's the most pragmatic university program that somebody can pick, so
exactly.
Obviously having that certainty is a must.
Yes. So he knew the value of certainty.
Right.
He was also an architect. He had built with a professional architect the mansion of one of his sisters in Vienna, which luckily still stands, one of the great modernist buildings of the period. And it's famous for its exactitude in every possible detail. It was finicky, fastidious to the nth degree, drove the working crews utterly mad. So this is the man who also has a devout convictions, let's call them. Anyway, he felt he was on a kind of a holiday at the end of his life. He never felt he had written more clearly, never thought better on these subjects. He went back to, how is it we have certainty? Because he knew as an engineer, he knew as someone who respected science very, very deeply, that we're working with it. We're building a lot of stuff with our limited knowledge. Why does it work so well? So he looked at it from the opposite attitude. So this great postmodern philosopher is saying, how come it works when it shouldn't work?
Right.
And one of the points he makes that I wanted to bring to your attention and to your listeners this day is one of his aperçus, one of his axioms that he draws from it. He says, apropos of Descartes and a philosophy of doubt, he says, it takes a great deal of certainty to have any doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Using the German word, it's written in German. And German, doubt still means what it says. It means to be in two. So doubt comes from doppio, double, two, right? Yeah. Du in French, double, all these words with double, with the Latin word for two, but we don't hear it in English at all. Even in French, one never thinks about it.
Yeah.
What does this word mean? It means to be in two places at the same time, right? So what are you going to do? You have to make a decision, but you're in two places.
Right, yeah.
In German, it's very, very vivid because the word for doubt just comes from the word for two directly. The word they use for two still, for zwei, zweif, is to doubt, right. To be in two. Right. So he's writing about, what is it about doubt? And he points out the most obvious thing about it. If I want to doubt something, I want to doubt that I'm in the Department of Theology here. So I tell you this. I have to not doubt that I said it.
Right.
That it's communicated. that there's a second person who understands what I just said, that there's a thing called theology, that there's a building dedicated to it, and on and on and on and on and on and on and it goes. It's a perfectly almost banal observation.
Right.
So he says, when Descartes famously says, that, basically, the only certainty I have is that I'm thinking.
Right. Yeah. Je pense donc je suis.
Exactly.
I know they're birthing. Yeah.
Exactly. He said, yeah. No, he believes that cogito means something. Ergo means something. Sum means something. Uttering it means something. Writing it means something.
Right.
Where did that come from? Tremendous certainty. He said, yes, the foundations have no foundations, he says, on certainty. Gewissheit, as the Germans call it. That kind of hiss in the word. And yes, he accepts the Kantian and Humean skepticism. We cannot know the thing in itself. Mm-hmm. It's true. Because we're in language. We don't have an Archimedean lever outside of it to know that it isn't all a kind of delusion. Right. Granted, he doesn't fuss with that. Certainly true to him. He won't take that, he won't minimize that risk. So the foundations have no foundations. And yet, everything rests, all of our doubts rest on a basis of discriminations that have to be fixed and settled for us to doubt anything at all, to think at all, to inquire, to go back to the meaning of the word historia. Right. In classical Greek, and it's really a verb to inquire, and then this substantive inquiry, or inquiries in the case of Herodotus' title. That's why they call it the histories. They're just quoting the text, transliterating it. And that works, that functions, and that is, and a community has a whole set of practices based on it. And yes, it will change those practices over time. You can see that in the life of Christ. Right. The evil doesn't enter us through the mouth, he shockingly says to his Jewish listeners. So you can eat whatever you want. Don't bother me with that. It's like, that is an extremely radical statement.
Yeah. Well, for the time, yes.
Yeah. In some way, of course, for any culture that retains dietary principles, be it Leviticus, Deuteronomy, etc., and the Quran, that's just a mischievous renegade at work. And of course, Yeshua ben Yosef, as he would have been called, was certainly, mischievous. But we see there, a paradigm shift, as we used to call it. There's a movement. Those practices have changed for a certain Jewish group that eventually becomes a Gentile faith. Under, of course, Paul. We don't need to go into that with the theologians who may be listening today. They know it a lot better than I do. But for Wittgenstein's, let's call it a postmodern theology, what we have is an emphasis on is a set of practices, and we have a consensus. Religion is very, very good at articulating its consensus.
Right.
Other forms of agreement are not. Secular political life is a good example. The problem is that we of the difficulty of having any kind of consensus. So we see in the United States, we think, okay, there's a consensus around the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. But in fact, there isn't a consensus on it. That's what we learned in the last 6, 7, 8 years.
Yeah. Is
that actually the Constitution is subject to significant reservation, and I'm sure there's 25% of Americans who would rather their man was occupying the institutions of power than that the Constitution should be observed. That's a real shift. When you have a Bible, Quran, that's not a possibility, really. And if anything, Lutheranism, of course, only became more committed to a set of verbalized consensus.
Right.
We're not going to listen to the Pope Leo, heretic. We're going to listen to the Bible because it was written by God, or written. It communicates the will of God. We should be careful how that's phrased. It depends on where you are in Protestantism. So, but Wittgenstein is saying, look, the paradigms may shift in ways that are acceptable, and he calls it very usefully. In English, you call it a consensus of action. It's not a consensus necessarily of beliefs and words and statements. It's an action. This group does certain things the same way all the time. Yes, much of it without thinking about it. That's okay. If it needed to think about it, it would. When it needs to think about it, it will. And so maybe all our practices will be subject to transformation. But we have a consensus of action, and our religious practices are very, very good at articulating them, and they're also very good at revising them. We Catholics themselves no longer follow all the precepts, say, of Pope Leo.
Right.
So Catholicism too, of course, is a living faith, and so is that relativism? Is that something to fear? Is that something unacceptable? For someone like Wittgenstein, that was just an anthropological fact of being a human, like having 5 fingers, or 10 fingers. Sorry, 5 fingers usually 5 fingers, usually 2 hands, or facultative manual manipulation. You have that, it does things. It changes the way our biology is even structured, right? The theory that our brains grew because our hands went free. Digits allowed us to manipulate things, and the brain starts to figure out how to use this unbelievable tool, right? So Wittgenstein says, look, we have a set of practices built into us, and their mutation is not a refutation. Yes, the foundations have no foundations that we can philosophically demonstrate. But those are not necessitated for the flourishing of any group. And again, for him, societies organized around a set of religious beliefs were particularly exemplary in demonstrating how a consensus operates. The Mormons, for instance, so an example, I don't know, it was earlier in the morning, I mentioned them. The Mormons are defecting so much from a certain kind of model of Protestantism that indeed they hit the road, and they attempt to establish communities of shared purpose and goals through, in what used to be called, the territories.
Right.
Of course, reaching finally Utah. So
went from New York up to Utah because they got casted out or something, or
Oh yes.
And now 55. I was looking up the status just as a factoid. 55% of Utah is Mormon.
Yes. So there you have a very successful form of Christianity that was even seen as a deviation from Protestantism in the United States, which was partly established in order to guarantee the free practice of one's Christian beliefs, independent of government. And so something that looks like a total deviation, for instance, obviously, polygamy.
Right.
Now, there's no polygamy in Christianity, but it's in the Bible.
It happens in the Bible. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it does occur in the Old Testament. Abraham and Hagar and Sarah and
Smith. Exactly. That's why Smith and the founders of the Mormons return to it as primitive Christianity, as they call it. Right. That's the way it worked, and it should. It's seen as actually a kind of a mandate of belief thereby, but it splits them off from Protestantism. But they develop it. There's a small consensus of a small group, and it becomes a larger and larger. You say 55% of the state of Utah, and of course Mormons are well beyond Utah as well. And and quite independently of whether one has ethical reservations or not about that particular uh, uh, Protestant practice, with the scripture, it too, uh, argues has a divine providence.
I mean, even from a doctrinal point of view, when you look at Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness or Scientology, which I mean, in and of themselves, they consider themselves part of the Christian family or the larger family. But I think from Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic point of view, the reason why Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox would be the three major families and exclude Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses on the basic, most doctrinal tenet of all Christianities, which is, the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ from the cross. And the minute you disqualify that out of your set of doctrines or just the ensemble of Christian teachings that are prescribed in your denomination, whether it be Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, that's when, most of those people from those three families would consider Mormons and other, Jehovah's Witness and other types of movements to be excluded because they don't believe in that. Right?
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the Mormon doctrine of atonement, Jesus' atonement of human sin happens in the Garden of Eden. Right, and that is absolutely mind blowing for other, the main Orthodox lowercase o Christianities,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm not necessarily going to share my opinion on that, but I do understand where the mainline Christian families. I understand where they're coming from when they establish that in order to be a Christian, you must believe in the bodily resurrection of Christ from the cross.
Yeah.
I totally understand, because without that, you wouldn't have any Christianity per se, right? If it weren't for that. But then, with the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, you have these different movements that kind of blossomed.
Yes, but you see there. So again, in the terms of Wittgenstein, you have various kinds of consensus forming, dissolving, coagulating, in other forms. I used the example earlier of Jesus' defiance of the kosher imperatives, fundamental to the faith he was born and raised in,
right,
and which preceded him by centuries. Just as shocking, if not more, than denying the bodily resurrection. And indeed, in the United Church, in various liberal forms of Protestantism, there's obviously there are sects within it or groups within it. I'm not sure what's the best category term to use, that believe that what's most profound about the mission of Christ are not the miracles, but the moral teachings. And from Spinoza on, you have, of course, what they call the new criticism in the church, the new criticism of the doctrine of miracles and the textual challenges to some of the most the paramount tenets of Judaism and of Christianity, and of course Spinoza. We don't really know exactly what were the conditions, but of course he was anathematized in Amsterdam. He was driven out of the synagogue. And reading, his surviving work, you can kind of see why. But a lot of course, what Spinoza said then is quite acceptable to very, very pious and maybe even sometimes quite traditional or conservative elements in Judaism and Christianity. So, and for Wittgenstein, it's like, we do not have to find the single thing that distinguishes a set of beliefs. We have to look at how communities foster, often without articulating its paramount tenets, nevertheless foster them through their practice. So part of his interest was that he was interested in and it's been said of Wittgenstein that one element of a Judaism that had survived in him, it's probably kind of folkloric, I think, it's maybe sentimental, but his insistence on practice. Judaism is practice. It's what you do today and every day, pretty much every hour of the day.
Right, yeah. Islam is kind of the same way. Yeah.
Yes. And this other kind of a facultative feature, like, attend Mass on Sunday, high Mass, or in other ways of kind of rote participation in the beliefs of your faith. Those faiths and many others are immanent in all your practices, and certainly Wittgenstein is very good at articulating how whether it forms a kind of tangible everyday quality, or whether, yes, it's a Sunday morning exception to your week, there's a consensus of action operating there, and we should really pay attention to that. And those practices that are not founded on some kind of discursive, rational basis, sometimes founded on defiance of it, the bodily resurrection. Right. Who would really believe in a bodily resurrection?
Especially today.
I'd love to. I mentioned I lost my wife. Yeah, I'd like resurrection. Yeah, I'm in. Definitely
now.
Yeah,
on tap.
Absolutely. Yeah. But that said, yeah, I don't live in hope of that. But those beliefs for Wittgenstein are powerful, partly because they don't need justification. They're what is done. He ends the Tractatus, so work at the very beginning of his career. In fact, the only work of philosophy he published in his lifetime, only book of philosophy. It was an essay as well, and a lexicon he wrote when he was a school teacher. But he published very, very little. But the Tractatus he struggled to get published, took years. And it famously ends by saying, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent. Very biblical. You can see there's Ludwig Wittgenstein in the pedigree of the fathers. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent.
Right.
So for him, God. The less said, the better for him. Then you don't get these debates of, the reason we believe in polygamy is because, Solomon, David, indeed, Abraham. Well, we know the Semitic peoples were polygamists, and of course it was absorbed into their faith, once you have to start justifying it, say, well, it's in the Bible. Then you get into a problem, because then Spinoza can come along and say, well, if you actually look at the history of that book, you'll see it was written this way, but and now we have an entire papyrology, etc., that explains to us why God creates human beings twice, why light is on the first day and the sun on the fourth. Right. So those are scientific demonstrations. For Wittgenstein, that's all very interesting, fine and good, but it's got very little to do with faith and ethical life, with which it's inseparable, because it doesn't rest on something that you point to, in a library. It rests on this consensus of action, which is partly inherited and partly adapted culturally. And that doesn't mean it's robotic and ignorant. It recognizes that our most profound ethical commitments are elusive of rational demonstration. The Kantian ethical formula is not going to take you very far. The Bible, ironclad. No problem there. Like you said, you quoted the Decalogue. There it is. and that settles it.
Right.
For the community that holds those beliefs, or the Mormons who obviously regard the Book of Mormon
Right. And the Bible
as a sacred text.
Right.
Non-Mormons see it as a work of literary fabrication entirely, or delusion. If you're particularly critical of that particular history, we're speaking impartially about all of these practices today. Again, simply to underscore this notion that Wittgenstein's good at reminding us that postmodernism isn't a bugbear. It isn't a way of saying, "Oh, you just believe whatever you believe." It means we have to take the variety of religious experiences, to quote the title of William James's great book, very seriously, and it should inform our ethical norms. And it does allow groups from within those denominations to challenge sometimes hidebound or increasingly disturbing, or what are perceived as disturbing views of it. We live in a society that aspires to an equity that the Hebrew Bible does not espouse. It doesn't create those terms. Does that mean that observant Jews have to deny women employment in a company that they own, or where they have a human resources position? Probably not. Not because they're hypocrites, but because there's a consensus that operates, and it comes from different areas in society, and it crystallizes in different kinds of practices. So we see religion is always mutating. I mentioned, of course, the defiance of kosher law in the new so-called New Testament.
Right.
That's that has been absorbed into religious life in the West, and it has. So it's not fixed and settled. When King Alfred the Great, the only king the British called the Great. I know we're only a few days from the coronation of Charles III, and Alfred. He may have been himself illiterate, but he was very pious, and he understood that the English churches, the English communities, were organized around the principles of the religious faith encoded in the Bible, which he, as I say, probably could not read. Depends which biographies you read of Alfred. In the 8th century. And Alfred commissioned a translation of the Bible. This is an Old English, or technically called Anglo-Saxon. I believe it was Alcuin, one of the great religious figures of the early church. And Alfred said, let's get that book into English. What was then English? Now to read it, you have to study it for several months before you can decipher it. As a way that our priests will understand better what is the basis of our belief, and of course himself, and the larger community, the laity. So Alcuin goes off and starts translating it. It's fine. He already knows Hebrew and Greek. It's not like St. Jerome, who, of course, according to the legend, had to withdraw into the wilderness and learn classical Hebrew, and then learn to translate what becomes the Vulgate, the Christian scriptures.
Right.
Anyway, he goes out there, and we have the letter. In fact, we have passages Alcuin translated into Anglo-Saxon. Now we're talking, almost 800 years before the Protestant Reformation, before Luther translates the Bible, and before King James, mandates an authorized version of the Bible for use in the Anglican Church, etc. So Alcuin comes back and says, I'm not going to do this. Here's what I recommend you not do it. Translates the passage for him. It says, "Do you see how our not only our laity, but even our priests are not necessarily sufficiently doctors of theology to explain to themselves, much less to the laity, why it is the English Christians would not practice, for example, since you mentioned it, polygamy." So he notes that polygamy is not a practice in in Anglo-Saxon society. As far as I know, pretty much, certainly in recorded history, not at all. And it was taboo, in a sense. It was unacceptable.
Right.
So what are we to do about that? Or the incest, right? The drunkenness of Noah, Ham, etc. Says we theologians understand that. So the usual answer for that is allegory. Right. By then already a 1,500-year-old tradition of how to read texts against their literal meaning. There's Thomas of Aquinas has some very good things to say about the literal meaning of the Bible, and we understand that it's that one cannot restrict the Bible to a literal reading, but not even the priests we now currently authorize to preach and to administer the sacraments will understand it. So put it away. And they did. And so we wait another 700 years for an attempt to produce it under an entirely different context. So we see again how the paradigms shift. So yes, the Bible is seen as one kind of authority. Sometimes it's seen as a dubious or troubling authority, or no authority at all. And for postmodernism, this is not a refutation of the beliefs of a community. It's a refutation of the view that any one of those communities is going to achieve the Platonic ideal of the worship of God. And I say that advisedly because Plato believed there was access to a principle of the divine. That's why one of the main reasons why he recommended that a utopian republic must include poets, because they tell stories about the gods, which are blasphemous, heretical, contradictory. In other words, exactly like he was aware of it, of course, didn't exist in the 4th century, 3rd century ways that he could have referred to. But of course, the Bible is a perfect example of that.
Right.
The Bible also looks heretical and blasphemous. But again, from a postmodern point of view, it's a set. There are kind of inherent practices available there, and they emerge. And postmodernism just says, let's pay attention to not just the paradigm, but the patterns of paradigms that emerge around our beliefs, and see if we can't, and see what kind of convictions, what kind of gewissheit, certainties we can assume. We assume the principle of equity is a certainty. And it's frustrating to us in a secular context that we can't actually philosophically, ethically prove it. Unless you're a Platonist. Platonists will say, no, we can do that. There's the idea of equity. Of course, Plato would never held the doctrine of equity whatsoever in a structurally misogynistic society. I say, regretfully, being a great, admirer of classical Greece, Greek philosophy and literature, but there's no mystery about that. But it is anguish for us, and our frustration with the fact that we can't establish a seemingly ethical universal around, say, equity, to launch tirades against postmodernism, which we hold responsible for that societal impotence, really, to establish an ethical absolute.
Right. That definitely covers a lot of ground. And now, we could discuss the literary context, because I'm not sure if you had something planned for 11:30, because it is kind of 11:30 right now. So unless you want to go a bit further, because I don't mind.
I have
You know,
another half hour
if
myself.
that's
I've postponed a meeting with, yes, a literature
right,
scholar
right,
on whom we had worked on an anthology of criticism of Mordecai Richler, a Montreal secular Jewish writer who often alienated his local Jewish leadership by his irreverence. As a satirist,
right.
very easy to make jokes about biblical beliefs or Judaic practices, and he was um, uh,
Excommunicated,
well, he
kind
was very
of.
scornful of it.
Yeah.
Eventually, he was absorbed back into that community, partly as a result of his similarly rather biased and vehement satirical attacks on Bill 101 in Quebec, the language law, the francisation, and he became he was, as Jews in Quebec felt that the language laws were looking a little bit like
Stringent.
ethnic nationalism. They'd
Yeah.
seen that before,
Yeah. Yeah.
but uncomfortable facing it. He then became their kind of Moses, leading them into the promised land of secular, multicultural polyglotism, and
Right.
demanding rights for non-French communities in Quebec. So that's how he made his way back. Anyway, I'm meeting a colleague from another university who has many things she has done. Her services to Canadian literature was involved in an anthology, or I should say, a journal issue in the journal called Canadian Literature that was partially dedicated to Mordecai Richler as a Quebec writer. And again, I go on that tangent because it illustrates what I hope is my one little point is, you have consensus of actions. A lot of even liberal Jews in the 1960s and 70s felt Richler had compounded the misrepresentations of the Jewish community, just in the shadow of the Shoah. Can't you show a little bit of respect? Have not enough people died? The Yiddish language was pretty much destroyed by the Nazis. No one speaks it hardly hear it anymore in Montreal. I have to go to very particular areas to hear a bit of it, closer to the Orthodox communities, of course, near Avenue du Parc.
Autrement, yeah.
Autrement, yeah.
Right.
And then the paradigm shifts, and then the language laws raise a new set of problematics, and Richler is welcomed. And also Jewish liberalism changes as 20 years go by, and Richler's no longer such a provocateur in that context.
Right.
Those debates have been weathered and have seasoned that community, and they're able to assimilate him the way Spinoza, is now recognized by many as one of the great Jewish thinkers. And Leopold Bloom, in Ulysses, when a anti-Semitic nationalist fanatic assails him in one of the most famous scenes in Ulysses, the Cyclops episode. And Leopold Bloom, whose father was Jewish, and is not a practicing Jew, says, Baruch Spinoza was a Jew, to provoke him. And then what really gets him in trouble, and your savior was a Jew. Then he has to run for his life out of the bar, as the citizen, as he's called, runs after him. So something like that, one sees how this consensus shifts without damage to Judaism. Judaism, can absorb heresy. Often it's the heretics who lead a faith into a renaissance of practice, something that is regarded as a provocation. Think of all the heresies about the Trinity, held in the early church, or heretical thinkers. So James Joyce, was in the Index, the Catholic Index. You couldn't buy a copy of Ulysses in a Montreal libraire, bookstore. You could go to an English bookstore and find it, but not in a French one, because that bookstore would be persona non grata if it sold the book. And yet he's the most Catholic of all 20th century writers. And good luck trying to read Ulysses without a basis or at least a willingness to learn the tenets of Christianity, generally in Catholicism, particularly, and Judaism, as well as, say, as a Jewish protagonist in Leopold Bloom. And it's just a profoundly religious text. And one of the challenges of teaching it is simply that this writer, who in some ways paramount Catholic figures and Catholic literary figures since the Renaissance, is becoming unintelligible to emerging generations of readers in a completely secular setting, where that these beliefs are not inculcated, and even this history is not much taught, especially in Quebec, where there's still a kind of a migraine from the Duplessis era,
right,
and of the church's domination in Catholic life until 1965, to the Révolution Tranquille, the Quiet Revolution.
Right. Which was a complete paradigm shift. And I often have this conversation with, most of my friends that are French Canadians, despite the fact that, it's laughable because I'm from Toronto originally, and,
So am I.
Oh, you really? Which part of Toronto?
The Italian area. So St. Clair, College Street. My father had a butcher shop in the Italian, if I was Italian.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, okay.
So,
and your mother's German, so...
My mother's a Southern German, Munich. Yeah,
Munich.
Catholic, as I was saying earlier, too. At least
Right.
culturally.
Yeah, I'm from Scarborough, and
yes.
grew up in Mississauga for a while, and then moved here when I was a kid. So I grew up in Laval, pretty much, in Quebec most of my life.
All right.
And...
Welcome.
Yeah, like 20
It's
years
usually
later.
the other way around.
Yeah.
There was a massive internal immigration when I was young of Anglo-Quebecers and so-called allophones. I don't particularly like these terms. To say the least, sounds like Jim Crow.
Right.
But internal immigration of those groups to Ontario, like us in Toronto, we're suddenly seeing all of these Quebecers running away in the face of Bill 101,
Yeah, like that massive exodus, or like, well, not massive, but like...
it was massive.
Okay.
It was massive.
Well, probably not as massive as, the Quebec exodus of Francophones to the States, because now, like, you go to the Atlantic Northeast, like it's Maine, New Hampshire, down all the way, I think, to Pennsylvania. Like, you have all these folks that have French last names, but that don't speak French because, like, they're fourth generation French Canadians.
Well, think of one of the great postmodern American novelists, whose name was Jacques Kerouac. Jack Kerouac.
Okay.
Who was raised in French.
Interesting.
His family had moved
heard the name, but I'm not too familiar with
On
that.
the Road.
Yeah.
It's the novel with which he's most closely associated, about the Beat generation, the Beatniks, and his family had joined that massive immigration to work in the mills of New England and Lowell, Massachusetts, but his family remained French, and he always spoke French. And he, in fact, he died relatively young, but he was planning to write a novel in French when he died. He was going to go back to French. And in fact, he's a profoundly French writer. Profoundly.
Interesting. So he's one of those rarities, or scarcities, rather.
Yeah, but part of what made him a kind of heretical voice in the 50s was that he was coming from a very different world. And he didn't look like an immigrant at all. He was a native English speaker, white, male American,
right.
But he was as ethnic as they come. He was Catholic in a Protestant part of the world. He was French in an English part of the world, and he did not identify himself readily with that world. And he wrote this kind of renegade book about finding a different America out there than the one that was being confected by liberal expansionist capitalism and neo-imperialism, put it in the most negative terms that Kerouac, I think, would have approved. But yeah, you have that migration. But the thing about the migration, the internal immigration to Ontario from Quebec, was that this was the upper middle class that was moving,
Right.
And affluent populations. Like, it drained intellectually and financially Quebec. It's been 30 years of recuperating from that kind of drain. It's like something of what was afflicted Nazi Germany with the massive immigration of intellect. So she obviously Jewish German intellect and money.
Yeah. Albert Einstein, that's one of them.
Yeah, Wittgenstein.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, where did he live to?
Well, he started studying in England, and after the Nazi seizure of power, he was Austrian, so there was the Anschluss. Suddenly, he was in Nazi Germany, right. And he took British citizenship.
Right. And I've always been interested because the word heretic, I really investigated it, and basically means
to choose for oneself.
Yeah, it's a school of thought.
To choose for oneself.
To choose for oneself.
It's a verb, a middle verb, so a reflexive verb. I decide.
Right. Yeah. Well, but yeah, that would follow basically one's singular choice, or basically according to their thought.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's weird to me how in Catholic circles, how this word has picked up so much dirt, and it basically yeah, as you're saying, like, it's to choose for oneself, and it doesn't necessarily doesn't necessarily mean like making the bad choice,
no.
Or it doesn't necessarily have to have a demonic element to it,
No.
So, but yeah,
it's personal conviction.
Right.
It's wrong to do that. I'm not going to do it. So
right.
Socrates is called a heretic,
right.
and it leads to his trial on a charge of corrupting youth and introducing novel forms of devotion. So all trumped up charges, and he's convicted and eventually executed, rapidly executed for it. But that's another story. But one of the words that Socrates uses at his trial, so the word heresy is used. So it's a verb. I'm thinking for myself.
Right.
Should I do this? Again, the postmodern. Okay, we do this. They don't. Is there some reason why I should review why I do it? It's not, as it turns out, a universal. It doesn't make me better or my group superior, probably. So what is it? What are we doing here? And a word that Socrates uses in his trial that is even more pejorative than heretic, and which we still use very pejoratively, is idiot.
Yeah, which basically, an idiot is not a stupid person. Idiot is someone who's senseless. Right?
No, it doesn't even mean senseless. Okay. It's from the same word that gives you idiom. That is to say, that which is singular and just to oneself. It means really to oneself.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Idiot is someone, again, who doesn't follow the crowd.
Right.
And so idiotess is called. So Dostoevsky has a famous novel called The Idiot. That is the Russian title too, I'm told. Precisely on that sense. The idiot is the one who chooses for him or her or themselves. And if that is outside the herd's view,
right.
That's called heresy. That's called idiocy.
Well, with that kind of definition, it really surprises me how, with time, it kind of picked up this synonymity with the word stupid.
Mm-hmm.
But stupid would be lacking intelligence. But the idiot, from what you're describing, does not. There wouldn't be an iota of an inkling that would lead me to believe that it's synonymous with stupidity.
No, well, when Socrates usually uses it neutrally, because for the Greeks it wasn't assigned with ignorance or retardation or any of the kind of negative connotations that have historically been attached to the word, but it's associated with heresy. And as you say, there's a term that for a secular is a kind of squid cloud thrown across one's biases. He, she, they are not doing what we do. They're choosing for themselves.
Right.
We don't tolerate that. Yeshua ben Yosef over there just said that, I can eat pork.
Right.
He's an idiot. And that's literally what he was in that respect, in the Greek sense.
Yeah.
Idiotes.
Yeah. Not to insult. Right?
Yeah. He is a heresiarch. He is leading us into heresy
Right.
if we follow those beliefs.
Right.
And they're right. It's absolutely true. That is incompatible with the consensus of action, and one of the consensus of action for Judaism is that it has to be consistent with our understanding of Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Our understanding of Scripture.
Yeah.
It's
like ours, my understanding. So like it's very not
it's your understanding alone. So that's Luther.
Right.
That's, of course, Luther's a heretic.
Right.
Christ is a heretic, or the figure we call Christos, the Mashiach, the Messiah,
right.
the chosen one, is well, I don't know if you've seen Monty Python on the Holy Grail. I've showed it to my youngest children a few weeks ago, so I remember it now. And so maybe the funniest line in the film is a whole crowd is assembled before Brian's house, and they have decided on the basis of what they regard as miracles that he is the Mashiach.
Right.
And his mother comes to the window, and she'll have none of it because she knows what he's like. She knows what he is. That's not the Messiah. He's not a Messiah. He's been a very naughty boy. And Yeshua ben Yosef was a very naughty boy.
I like this exactly just created on my Audacity recording. So it's just like these pipes are just...
And it's true.
Yeah.
But that is how you get the formation of a new kind of consensus. And
right.
sometimes, it's based on Scripture. Jesus quotes Scripture all the time. It's not like he was ignorant of it.
Right. No, he was a very rabbinic leader, and very cognizant of the law.
Oh yeah, look like one of the two last things he says on the cross, right?
Father, forgive them for
lama sabachthani, when he speaks in Aramaic, and it's actually written in Aramaic in the Greek New Testament.
Why have you forsaken me?
Yes, Father, why have you forsaken me? And then he says consummatum est, or what Jerome translates in the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, is consummatum est. It is finished. It is done.
Right.
It's actually the Greek word for it. It has come full circle.
Right. Yeah.
Is what he's saying.
He also says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do."
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, and so you have Jesus there, quoting. So it's the most powerful line, of course, in a way, in the gospel. When we even hear him in Aramaic, we finally hear Jesus speaking in his own language. We have no reason to believe he had any Koine Greek, the common everyday Greek, vernacular Greek that was spoken in the Levant, but in which the New Testament is exclusively written. And there you see him speaking his own tongue. He's quoting directly from Scripture. He's quoting Isaiah.
Right.
At the very moment of his death, he's linking his faith to the Bible, to Isaiah's authority and the truth. So so you'd say there's a contradiction at work here. Look, Yeshua, make up your mind.
Yeah.
No, that's not how consensus are formed. What looks like a heresy becomes an acceptable set of principles within the church. Right. And again, we have, and Wittgenstein is not the only example. I'm just trying to keep it down to one today. A thinker who is interested in that fact that we have these we have seemingly incompatible views. What permitted the Hebrew, the Jewish scriptural leadership to admit into Scripture the Song of Songs, which never mentions the Word of God, I'm told. Certainly not in any translation I've read. Once. Never. There's one other book of Scripture that doesn't mention it as well. But here you have the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs. The best song. Song of Solomon. It looks like it's a series of love poems that have been pretty badly edited together because they kind of seem to forget what they just said and move on. And yet, of course, some of the most powerful erotic poetry in any Western tradition, they put in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
What is biblical about it? Well, the answer is, for some of them, again, it goes back to the term we conjured earlier, allegory.
Right.
That the bridegroom is the divine. And the bride is the Shekinah or the laity,
Mm-hmm.
and
The church, or
the church. And when I look at one of my edition of the authorized translation of the Bible, it has a running gloss, and the running gloss at the top of the page will say, so the passage from the Song of Songs is, I will. I'm panting in expectation of the beloved. His hand is on the door. He'll turn the knob. I've brought my fruits. And the whole text is wildly erotic.
Right. Yeah.
And on the top, the church welcomes God, I'm paraphrasing now. Yeah. Admits admits God. Like, but where? When I was younger, it's like, where is that in here anywhere? Where am I missing it now? A Hebrew scholar could say, I don't speak Hebrew, talked to a few, read a bit about it, will say, well, yeah, but the word God never appears as such. Of course, the holiest name of God is never uttered. He is the nameless one.
Yahweh, basically.
Yeah, but even the Tetragrammaton, don't name it.
Right. Yeah.
Jehovah, just add syllables. And it's too sacred to be named, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent.
Interesting.
There's Wittgenstein, right? There's a taboo. Don't talk about God. Don't use that word.
And it reminds me of when Moses was asking God, okay, well, how do I refer to you? Just say I am, right? And that
I am that I am.
And I am that I am, which is echoed by Jesus in one of the Gospels. I think it's John, where before everything was, I am, right?
Yes.
Which kind of echoes the presence of the Logos back in Genesis.
Of course.
The tree of life, which comes back in the book of Revelation, part of my master's thesis.
Absolutely.
Tree of life it starts with the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, but then it ends with the tree of life, which is not the same tree as the tree where Adam took the fruit.
Mm-hmm. And don't forget,
it's another tree.
The tree of life, and don't forget the middle tree, right. Golgotha.
Oh, Golgotha. Okay, interesting. Yeah,
right. The three.
So there's a third tree that I didn't know of.
Well, in a sense, the crucifixion is a kind of the tree between the two,
right?
Which
in where in
permits Luke, the incarnation.
Yeah, and in Luke and the Book of Acts, I think it refers to the cross as a tree. When I was reading that, like in late 2020, when I had COVID and I needed something to cope with before actually starting my master's back in fall of 2021. Why exactly is Luke in the Book of Acts talking about a tree or a savior resurrecting from a tree? I was thinking, okay, well, I know he came from a T, not a tree. Like, well, where's the tree coming from? Yeah. But then, I think that's to echo like
because
Genesis.
You'll see in medieval, if you go into a Gothic cathedral and you see trace stained glass, the tree of life, and then you'll see the tree of the crucifixion. The idea not to look at the crucifixion as dedicated to death, but the new life and the incarnation of God, the revelation of God. So it becomes a tree of life, right. You see, through the resurrection. That's how that iconography, that allegory, again, had been established already from late antiquity. And in the case of the Hebrew, like you were saying about apparently the Hebrew for I am that I am, it's even more ambiguous, like, I am. It's just like,
not even just paradox in the middle.
Yeah, I think it's we'll not go into it. I haven't brought the source with me, but I have read on that term. But in any event, the what is clear is that in the Song of Songs because the Hebrew puns very easily,
Right.
especially the written form, where of course no vowel is signaled. Hebrew was devised, the Phoenician script, prior to vowels. So many words look like the same word because you only have three consonants, and the two vowels between them are absent.
Right.
So it puns mischievously, in a way, you'd say. Almost, I mentioned Finnegan's Wake earlier. It puns like Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, in a sense.
Right.
But what can be argued is that the Song of Songs is constantly punning on the names of the divine, and is treating it as the absolute foundation, so that the erotic element of the poem is saturated in the idea that a connubial union, that a sanctified sacramental tie, even though actually the Song of Songs never talks about marriage in any way or shape or form, but it's often sung at weddings, is a spiritual tie, and is a form of rehearsing other sacraments, but involving God more directly. And so the vows one takes in marriage manifest the divine order and repeat the relationship of the divine to the human, and the incarnation then of course go forth and multiply in the reproductive imperatives that are associated with Judeo-Christian social morality. It's that's the argument. But I was saying earlier about the Song of Songs is that it has to be absorbed. And I believe there was a period where there was some pressure on it, and certain rabbinical elements kind of said, no, we don't need it, and then it was drawn back, partly from its beauty. And then you have, Bernard, he writes like 30 sermons on the Song of Songs. It's
Bernard.
Saint Bernard.
Oh, Saint Bernard.
And, he never, he regards it as the most important work in the Bible, because it's about the affective connection. You have to love God. Not you have to fear God only, you have to love God. And you have to love the world because it's a divine creation. Right. And the Song of Songs is about an erotics of kind of spiritual jubilee, and the body is not a limitation on our religious life, but the vehicle of it, and the kind of taproot of our kind of living faith. So, Song of Songs gets treated as an allegory. There are various ways it is undertaken to absorb it, and so you see in practice how. Then Christianity had to decide whether it wanted the Song of Songs too, and it immediately associated the bridegroom with Christ, partly because of Jesus' parable,
right?
Of the wise and foolish virgins.
Right, yeah,
they are awaiting the bridegroom.
They're looking for. They want to fill their lantern with oil, and they're unable, and
they spend it all. They blow it all.
Yeah, and then they get kicked, or they stay at the door, and they can't come in.
That's right, exactly. They're not admitted to the
feast.
What Wagner would call the Liebesmahl, the sacramental feast. I'm thinking of Parsifal and Wagner, his most Christian text at the end of his life, Christian quasi-opera. I think he calls it a Spiel, a play. But because Jesus had confected a parable about the divine as a bridegroom, the Christian fathers looked at the Song of Songs and said, as a bridegroom. Though the term is never used, as far as I know, in the Hebrew, certainly in no translation. He's just the lover, the beloved. And so there it goes. So again, an element that could be readily regarded as heretical. This is just about extramarital sex, or teenage sex, because she gets into some trouble. Right. The bride at one, or the woman, the bridegroom doesn't even enter into it, and he's the brother.
Yeah.
My brother, my sister. Everything about it is just trouble, and yet there it is, not only in the Bible, but in the Christian Bible, and regarded by Bernard, and not exclusively by Bernard, as the most important mystical revelation, the Shekinah, especially for the Jews, of the woman as a kind of the precursor in Judaism of the cult of Mary.
Right.
I mean, that's putting it very, very crudely, but that element. So different traditions find different ways of regarding something heretical or unassimilated as consistent and indeed formative for the exercise of a living faith. So again, from a postmodern point of view, that's a living practice. That's how communities work. It's not a question of whether these are rational. You don't win to these beliefs by affirming a logical argument about it. For Wittgenstein, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one should remain silent. And that's the German pretty much. Wovon man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss schweigen. I think that's the German. He has to be quiet about that. And that was his view of ethics, really, finally. And that's what he liked about religion. Religion doesn't go to a philosophy seminar to justify its practices. We might say, oh, it should. There are things we permit in our religious practices that should not be tolerated. So as a Catholic, we described how we were both raised in Catholicism. Very, very difficult for our generations is the exclusion of women from ordination,
which
has been controversial, of course, in Anglicanism, and had been admitted in other Protestant churches, United Church here in Canada, female ordination, no problem at all. And there have been various ways Protestant churches have dealt with it. The Lutherans, they'll have the wife of the pastor involved in the sacramental feast, for instance. Right, yeah. So there have been different stages. But in general, that's a problem. And there's a consensus that says we do what's in the tradition and in the Bible.
Right.
And there are no female apostles.
Yeah.
There are no female disciples. They say, well
Mary Magdalene was one of the friends,
It's very contentious
Martha,
figure, yeah. Sure. The Marys,
yeah.
who actually go to the tomb, who see that it's empty and loot, who look at it and are afraid,
right. They're the first to know, and then afterwards they tell Peter and John, I think, and then they kind of race for it, and they get there and they realize, oh crap, well, he's no longer here, and better tell the others. And
exactly. Yeah. So in Catholicism, you're stuck with that. There are good arguments on both sides, logical arguments.
Right.
Whereas from a certain kind of postmodernism, it's just not a matter of an argument.
Mm-hmm.
And if I suspect a Wittgensteinian view of Catholicism would say, if you're uncomfortable with this proscription, leave the faith. There are other faiths. There are faiths where this prescription has been lifted,
right.
which is true. And that's how you get a living faith for him. But he doesn't see any utility in debating. It's kind of bad for how do you get reform inside. Very significant reform.
Right.
It's what they call, in philosophy, of course, gradualism. We do these things gradually, and we live in a society, well, we can't afford gradualism. We can't abide by an injustice
right
at this moment.
Yeah.
Especially let's say the Universal Charter of Human Rights. It violates the Charter of Human Rights, but meanwhile, you have communities living in your country that have their own charter of human rights.
Yeah, because it's very interesting that you kind of riffed on this particular point, because I had 2 episodes ago I had a Reverend Carla Holmes. She's a priest. I was going to say priestess, but she corrected me on that. Priest, because I think priestess was the feminine and priest was the masculine or whatever. Anyway, and so Carla Holmes is a priest in the Anglo. In the Anglican Church, which is kind of like interchangeably Anglican or Anglo-Catholic, and we talked about feminism and that kind of thing, and the different types of feminisms, because people try to box all the people that would call themselves feminists in one particular category where among themselves they have contradictions and disputes, for their own deals. So and she was talking about, and I actually mentioned, a lot of my evangelical friends being against having women ordained as pastors, and I even went into depth, like telling even some of my Catholic friends who are women would even be against that, even if I were to bring it on a silver platter to them.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was wondering why.
Sure.
And her explanation was actually astonishing, because she said that those women in Catholic churches that would not want women to get ordained, even though they themselves are women, view themselves in some sort of metaphysical or psychological sense as wives of the priest in a sort of way, and not officially, but in a conceptual sense. I was floored. I was like, I've never looked at it this way. Perhaps because I'm a man and I don't understand or think the way that women think, right? And so, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I bet this is a postmodern issue that we're still going to grapple with for the next few years, to see if, whether in evangelical churches or Roman Catholic churches, which are the two denominations that I'm mostly, focusing on for my thesis, are there going to be any reforms in those particular? Yeah.
Well, as I said, like when I was in Turin, no, I don't know how you say it in English. Anyway, the region of Germany they call the Lutherland, the land of Luther in
Wittenberg,
Germany.
and
exactly,
yeah.
And where he was born, and where he took shelter and translated the scriptures into German, etc. I attended a Lutheran service there, and I say the wife of the pastor um, um, administered the sacraments alongside the pastor. She was not herself ordained, but that was in that church how an element of equity was being introduced.
Right. Which is different from equality. Equity, equality is not necessarily the same thing.
Well, in that one, where in in that church there was no female ordination, you see, but this was permissible, or had been rendered permissible. So we mentioned Mormonism, the early what becomes the Christian church. Of course, Jesus is not founding a church. Paul founds a church.
Peter and Paul, yeah.
Yeah, and I'd say it's really Paul. Paul says we're going to have a Gentile church. We're going to turn our back on actually the reforms we were going to make to our beliefs. Right? There's not a thing there's not a scrap of anything Jesus ever says that shows the slightest interest in Gentiles. That's later.
He does visit a Samaritan woman, so there's kind of that, inkling. Right?
Yeah. It's very important, for finding a kind of a genealogy of the Gentile faith, right, in what is such a sectarian dispute within Judaism, with the Essenes and Jesus and other breakaway practices. But the ordination of women from a postmodern point of view, at least will undertake to explain why women themselves, say within Catholic belief, would not support it.
Yeah.
So they belong to a Weltanschauung, a belief system within the church that has gendered the administration of the faith.
Right.
And introduces female spirituality in a different way. So you go into almost any church in Montreal, you're going to see Mary, 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 Mary. How many churches? Notre Dame, Notre Dame, Notre Dame.
Yeah.
If you were coming from another planet to Montreal, you would assume that the Catholic Church is a female worshiping church. Mm-hmm. If you just look at the buildings. So for a certain element, again, that element in the faith is consecrated and transcendental, and so it's unnegotiable.
Right.
For other amounts of Catholicism, no. There's a history within this transcendent. There's a transcendent belief, and there's historical doctrinal practices, and they have always reformed, and the reform now needs to extend to female ordination.
Mm-hmm.
From the postmodern point of view, that debate is what's of interest. The way they operate or fail to operate together, maybe break or not.
Right. One
break gives us the Protestant Reformation or the Orthodox Church, or the failure to achieve, what do they say in the Orthodoxy in the East? Symphonia,
mm-hmm.
the union of all of the Orthodox churches. Actually, there was a severance, right, in 2018, the Russian and the wider Orthodox Church. So, we see it over and over again, that the one way that these paradigms, one way that the consensus of action shifts is that finally it becomes articulated and it starts to crystallize around a set of heretical convictions. And it is heretical in Catholicism that a woman should administer the sacraments, read what happens at the Paschal Feast. It's a man who does that, according to that view. But then there's a whole tradition of reading Jesus also as a bridegroom, and there are allegorical readings of the Song of Songs that do that as well. And indeed, the Song of Songs is a perfect instance of it, because liberal feminist Judaism prioritizes the Song of Songs. It's one of the only places in the Bible where a woman speaks a lot, speaks very autonomously, defiantly, passionately, in many roles: mother, sibling, lover. There's a fourth that I can't remember now.
Partner.
Pardon?
Partner.
Yeah, beloved, certainly. Yeah, at least this gets translated, and in all those roles, exercises again a kind of autonomy, and instead of being ashamed of their feelings or of their female status, celebrates it, is proud of it, and sees it as a vehicle for this ultimately spiritual union that the Bible tells us that the sexual union of the Song of Songs anticipates or allegorizes, right? So the again, different groups, different times, different accents, and a kind of liberal theology doesn't, on a postmodern footing, it's not good at saying, no, but that's just wrong.
Right.
The Catholic Church is unethical. It exploits women, exploits their labor. You can even see it in the Bible. In the New Testament, exploiting female labor, but not then extending to it full membership. And Mary Magdalene, perfect instance, of Martha, the three Marys, etc. Woman, what have I to do with you? The famous denunciation of Jesus at the marriage feast of Cana, when his mother says, you can produce the wine. And she's wrong. She's the one who says, I know what you can do.
She recognizes the ability.
She sees him as the Messiah.
Right.
But he reprimands her. My hour is not come. There's very few references to Mary in the New Testament, right? And that's, of course, one of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation. They saw that as religious dualism. They were sexist, too. They didn't want any female. So the cult of the saints,
right,
Mariolatry, all was chastised as the decadent Babylonian church in exile, and the Babylonian captivity of the Christian church. Out it all went, right?
Interesting.
So Catholicism retains it passionately,
right,
and yet is surpassed by many Protestant churches in the 20th century and 21st, considering the ethical rightness, fitness of full equality in the administration of the church. And I was saying my mother was from Catholic Southern Bavaria, very conservative part of the country. I was talking to one of her relations one time, and everything there is Virgin Mary. The cult is in full career.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know God was a man in Southern Bavaria. And at some point in the discussion on some matter with this fellow who belonged to one of these guilds dedicated to the Virgin, Albert Lapa was his name, lovely man, and so he was describing some hardship in his community, and I said, "Well, you can appeal to the Virgin Mary. You can pray to her to intervene on your friend's behalf and help him in his crisis." And Albert Lapa was a construction worker. He knew nothing about theology. He corrected me immediately. This Mariolater immediately said, "Mary can't do that. I can only ask Mary to intercede with her son."
Right. Yeah, it's such a just the pattern, the hyperdulia that comes with Mary, and even prayers to the saints, with Saint Joseph and Saint Michael, and so it's all intercessional, right? And often that becomes a point of discord between Protestants and Catholics, where a lot of evangelicals and Protestants in general would be like, wait a second, I have a highway that leads me directly to God. Why would I not take this highway? Why would I have to go through all these different pedways, through saints, if to ask for some, if my friend's sick or something, to ask for prayers from them to get to God, if I can pray to God directly for what I need. Yes. And I'm not someone who is qualified or in a position where to judge who is right and who is wrong. And again, like I'm an overarching Christian more than anything else. Like I do consider myself Catholic, but not Catholic at all at some points, because if I go to evangelical services at 10 a.m., but then at the Sunday Mass at like 6 p.m., well, that's my thing, especially as a theology student,
It's ecumenical.
I'm very ecumenical.
Long tradition.
I would be an ecumenical, non-denominational Christian by faith, because I, out of respect for my Catholic friends, I would pray the Rosary, but I would respect my Lutheran or evangelical friends when they have their opinions on it. And I think all these roads lead to not necessarily Rome, but to heaven, I guess.
Well, it's polytheism, of course, for Protestantism. That's the cult of the saints, is a way of readmitting the worship of many gods, and of course the Trinitarian doctrine. Similarly, is seen in those terms. They're anti-Trinitarian and anti-Mariolatry. It's very consistent. And again, the shortcoming of the postmodern will be that it set aside the prioritizing of discourses and instead learns from, respects, and is intrigued by the incompatibility of views, both internal to a faith and interdenominationally. It's very, very good at explaining how that works. Just like in race matters, so it's kind of postmodernism that was very criticized in the 70s and 80s, because it suggested ultimately race is purely discursive. Don't even take it seriously. It's just a set of integers in a kind of alchemical mathematics that has to be demystified for what it is. It's just a way of justifying what the privileges of a certain kind of group. Get rid of it entirely. And of course, African Americans, Hispanics, and others, or Catholics earlier, when there was a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice in the United States, saying, yeah, but my community membership there is constitutive. And it is necessary because those groups are under challenge. We have to believe passionately that we are actually a group, that we are African Americans, that we are Hispanic, that we are something called Catholic, and it has this kind of integrity about it, even though no two Catholics exactly agree on every element of the faith. And don't give me a discursive set of tools to dismantle identitarian politics, because it's the only way we have any hope of successfully mobilizing to dismantle systematic racism. But the postmodern view is look, don't take it so badly. I mean, a postmodernism that says that the category woman is discursive, normative, doesn't deny you of that. But it sets up a warning to those who want to turn it into a kind of a hypostatized category that's absolute and it fixes you in your place. Be very, very suspicious of anything that says you're this thing, because you can be sure you're being told that so that you stay here and you don't go there.
Right.
And postmodernism is going to tell you what is the politics of that dynamic. It's not just going to say, yeah, you're not a woman, because postmodernism welcomes the idea of gender fluidity, racial fluidity, absolutely. Do you have to prove that you're indigenous somehow, like by blood quantum? That's setting aside a problem by turning it into science. Oh, science will do it for us. Well, that's not going to tell you what is the nature of your membership in that group. What are the other elements that permit one to self-identify as, say, belonging to an indigenous group, or Métis, or Inuit, to put it in Canadian terms, right? For a postmodern, it's like those different communities may have different ways of determining community membership. And that's what you want to pay attention to. And then you want to be very critical of the national political frame that says that's indigeneity. Okay, but what does that serve exactly? Are you sure that's another way to marshal resources to reserve a certain kind of status for a group and locate them on very fixed territories and according to a narrow definition? Do you see what I mean? So the postmodern doesn't have to cripple those debates. It should really foment them.
Right.
And certainly to just associate it with a kind of cynical relativism just deprives of its force. It's kind of like, having having a thoroughbred racehorse, and using it just to power your little carousel. It's like that horse can do a lot more for you. There's a lot of more value in this creature than just to turn around a well, let's say.
Right. There's more to the iceberg than just the tip. So.
Oh yeah, and take advantage of that fact that there's so much underneath that can float an original thought and a new kind of consensus of action, because we're never going to get the one that settles it. I had a German relation was visiting us from a few weeks ago, and he's now in his late 50s, and he said, I was raised on Star Trek in Germany. I was raised on Star Trek.
We have what's his name, Shatner, William Shatner, fellow Montreal.
Loves that. He knows all about that.
Figurehead.
He's actually an economist, a very bright liberal economist, very bright. Professor of economics, and
what's his name?
His name is Werner Antweiler, and Werner Antweiler, who teaches at the University of British Columbia, but is from Cologne. He said, I was raised on the NASA manned flights to the moon, satellite launches, Star Trek, Star Wars. I can't believe, that we don't, what we anticipated was a kind of a world federation, universal human rights, leaving aside the kind of petty-fogging sectarian disputes. He was particularly exasperated, of course, with the war in the Donbass and Ukraine, and the mischief and gerrymandering of electoral procedures in the United States, etc. And and I said to poor Werner, but they had their own ideologies, and you were kind of seduced into or enlisted into a set of expectations and beliefs which have partly been realized and partly aren't. That kind of world is not possible. You are going to have a contestation of any conviction. And the question is, can we create a society in which the contestation is fertile, mutually respectful, and not restricted to self-interest. That's all you can do. Where flying on Mars is not going to make us any less human, only more so. It'll just be carving that up. And say this is our part and that's your part. And read Gulliver's Travels. Jonathan Swift, who was an Anglican divine, that is to say, Church of Ireland in his case. He was the dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. Wrote Finnegan's Wake. Another Irishman from Dublin. He wrote Gulliver's Travels, describing the perpetual how someone even goes through a utopian society where all of the nonsense of human mischief-making disagreement has been cast off. You end up having a kind of fascistic society. I was talking about horses earlier. This is a horse society.
Right.
They're called in the fourth part of Gulliver's Travels from 1725. But you read that and go, my God, they're Nazis. They created a utopian society, but it's only by creating a certain kind of, again, subordinate class. Right. And Gulliver, even though he belongs to it, identifies himself completely with the mischievous, disfiguring belief system of this utopian society. So wherever you go, your utopia has to be kind of surpassed, because your utopia contains the seeds of all kinds of inequalities. It's very dangerous to think you've paved paradise, and put up a parking lot. Maybe we don't want another parking lot.
Yeah, this was probably
to quote Joni Mitchell, another Canadian note to round out our my long-winded discussion of Wittgensteinian postmodern theology.
Right. I mean, yeah, but I'd be definitely glad to have you back on, on the show. I mean, because we have a particular student who wrote a paper. His paper was on the Song of Songs, and I could envision like a particular discussion, like a back and forth discussion with he's Jewish actually, and he's going through some things, especially with family and all that, which I'm not going to delve into, but and he wrote a paper on that. And he's mostly focusing on Bernard Lonergan, so perhaps I could have him over and. But I mean, we hit the 2-hour mark, and I'd really like to go on further. And you're definitely welcome whenever. And I think that was a wonderful discussion. And I really like giving the floor to my guests and to have them drop the knowledge on me and on the viewers and listeners. And it was a lot of fun. We talked about a lot, and what really fascinated me the most, as a conclusive statement, was your knowledge of the Bible and your baggage about theology is quite vast and even deep. I mean, just mentioning the Song of Songs compared to most people that I've bumped into, like or invited on the podcast, because I've invited folks that are not from or do not have that theological knowledge. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, that's a wonderfully exaggerated account of my competence in that field. The only I'd say is that, if you do literary studies, then at some point you should feel quite compelled to make yourself aware of the actual cultural traditions out of which that literature is formed. If it were different literature, maybe not. Perhaps it's irrelevant. It's just the same way. Like if you're taught a course, for instance, on Henry David Thoreau, author of Walden, and Thoreau had an early exposure to Eastern philosophy. I won't explain why now. We're out of time. We should be out of time. And out of breath, but
so I mean, afterwards, I'm kind of like respecting your schedule for the day.
I'm just saying that if you're when I teach Thoreau, I have to go back to the Sanskrit philosophical and religious scriptural texts. And these terms are very loaded, very Western, because they were formative for him at a particular time when a certain branch of Buddhist thinking was beginning, incredible to think this, was only beginning to be understood. We knew a lot more about those beliefs in Aristotle's time
Right.
than we did until the 1850s. Incredible ignorance of those features. But so again, like if you're gonna teach us stuff, you better at least look at it and then look at the authorities who can tell you what is operating there and what is the tradition of that reception. And ultimately, you learn something about yourself and your beliefs or your aspirations or the possibilities of your work in a secular institution, especially in a period where the students are not particularly equipped for that. It really depends, obviously, on the student and their background. We have very, very, people who are very who are living their faith, but it's a whole range of faiths in a place like Montreal. So you better start studying Islam, because
Right.
maybe that's not in Walden, but it's in the classroom.
Right.
And so those paradigms are now reading into it and saying, oh, I see parallels here with a certain element in Sunni belief. I didn't expect to find that there. What did Thoreau know about the Sunni Islam? Almost nothing. But at least I can tell the student that, and then you follow that through. So that's a wonderful feature about being obviously in a liberal institution. It's just
Right.
that you're kind of allowed to study these things in a little bit more detail. And it's true that in my case, certainly on these subjects, I'm a kind of trained dilettante. That's about what it amounts to.
Yeah.
I'm writing a book on Samuel Beckett.
Right.
Right now, or finishing a book on Samuel Beckett. It's a different set of issues. He was raised in the Church of Ireland. So
Right.
there, you better know something about the Church of Ireland. You can't just look at Beck and say, oh yeah, he's really secular. Yeah, he writes a play called En attendant Godot. Gee, what's going on in that play?
Right, yeah.
So he was a cynical, nihilistic, very hostile to the church. Yeah, absolutely. So what's it doing in the title of his play? And what's it doing in that play? What's it doing in his work?
Right,
and at a certain point, if you're not in a position to understand Irish Protestantism at that moment, get out of the room. Let someone else do it.
And now that you just meant, because I've heard the title before, and maybe a decade ago when I was taking a French class back in Cégep, and now that, wait a minute, there's the word God in Godot. Like, wait, what the heck? Like, and I just took it for granted that, okay, that's just some French Canadian last name or whatever. Okay.
It's not an uncommon surname, in fact. It's not the rarest. But the play was written in French. That's why I gave the title in French. Right. It was written in 1953
He wrote in French, actually, yeah.
At that time in his life, exclusively. Earlier, exclusively in English, later in both. And he translated all his text both ways, subsequent to the success that Godot brought him. But I'll just say that it's true that when he wrote the play, was a totally obscure author, had no expectation that the play would ever be translated into any language, much less into English. And I think he made a miscalculation. So yes, to the French audience, En attendant Godot. Okay, sure. It's a name, it's a surname. Some people in the crowd will go, oh yeah, I get it. Yeah, that isn't that the English word for God? For Dieu, sorry. Yeah. Dieu en anglais. Oui. Oh, I get it. I can see that. Yeah. He didn't realize within 18 months he'd be asked to write it in English. And he didn't change it at that point. He translated it as waiting for Godot. And then he realized, now it's right in the title. Now it's blaring.
Yeah. It's hidden in plain sight, right?
Yes. And in fact, he started to use what he himself called a vaguening technique. Basically to move into, we talked about this earlier too, allegory. Right. To use terms where you're not necessarily going to get it. So he has a play called Endgame, Femme de Partie. The four characters of these names: Ham, Am in French, Nel, Nag, and Clove. Mm-hmm. Nag, Nel, Clove, Ham. Okay. Most people go, and it's like, those are funny names, especially
Right.
Clove. What's that?
Clove.
In Latin, V represents you. The value U, the letter U. And so Clove is also clou. Clou in French is a nail.
Right.
Ding. One character's a nail. Nail. Nail in Irish. Nail. Ooh, that's 2 nails. Is that a coincidence? Nag. Well, nag is a horse.
Right.
And a pejorative term for a certain kind of personality, costed personality.
Nag Hammadi library.
Yeah, well, too. Nag. Nagel is the German word for
nail?
Nail.
Okay.
Now we have 3 nails. And then we got a character named Ham. Ham, biblical name, of course.
Right, yeah.
Ham. So I started thinking, wait a minute.
Hammer, oh.
Hammer.
Not Hamlet.
Oh, Hamlet too, but
Hammer, okay.
3 nails. Where have you seen a hammer and 3 nails before?
The cross, there you go. Like one for both feet and one for each wrist, and not the hand.
No, 2 hands and 1 at the feet.
Right,
that's it. 3 nails and the hammer to crucify Christ. That's what Beckett started to do. So he didn't want to let go of religion. You see his library in his apartment. It was preserved, full of Bibles, French, Italian, Spanish, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, just the most odd. German, I remember. Italian, I don't know if I mentioned that.
Yeah.
Lots of marginalia all over it. Only body of books he had more of was on chess. And Endgame, of course, is a chess move.
Right.
It's a chess situation. But he brings it together, of course, in his work. So Beckett did disguise his culture, basically, because ultimately he just said, look, I was raised in the Church of Ireland. I'm a dirty low church Protestant. You can't reverse your upbringing. You can challenge it, you can question it, but that's how I was raised.
Right, yeah.
So of course I'm going to see issues in those terms. Great line in Godot. One of the beggars says, I just feel like Christ. And his partner, also beggar, says, you're not gonna start now comparing yourself to Christ.
Right.
And his partner says to him, I've been doing it my whole life. And who doesn't? Because you're actually encouraged to do that in Christianity. The Imitatio Christi is one of the most biggest bestsellers of the Middle Ages. The Imitation of Christ. How you understand that you are living Christ's life. Doesn't mean you're becoming God yourself. It's not a prescription for megalomania, but you have to understand. The Christ is a powerful figure because the situation is one in which we are encouraged to identify. So Beckett is full of that, but different ways to do it. Like he learned from the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs was more clever than Beckett. In the Song of Songs, they don't put the word God in it.
Right. Yeah.
But it's everywhere. According to one interpretation of that allegorical interpretation of the Song of Songs. Beckett made this exploit in the title of his play. Never did that again.
It's astonishing. Wow, it's just a lot of coded information, and people would look at it and take it for face value, or take it at face value rather. But then, when people look at it from a literary perspective and dive really deep into it, you realize, okay, well, it's not a coincidence that this guy, he was raised in, the Protestant Irish context, and then you go to his library at home, and he has all these different Bibles and all that literature, that kind of intertwines or justifies what he wrote. And then when you look at what he wrote, like it all makes sense when you look at it deeply enough. It's wonderful.
There's a whole library of theological interpretations of some of that. Yeah. And they're rich. They're, even if you don't have devotional commitments yourself, you can't deny the tracery that's been done. There may be different interpretations of what those references is doing. But allegory, I mean, the feature of it, last thing we'll say, we got to stop. We have places to go.
Right, for sure.
Is that part of its power for Christianity, especially as a universal faith, is that it's a universalizing rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
What allegory says is that a particular is also a universal. And so you can imitate the life of Christ. You can, in your particular experience, you can have, you can universalize those experiences with reference to the scriptural precedent of the life of Christ. And and I think that for Beckett, that was still a very powerful feature of Christianity. The idea that it's for everyone. Mm-hmm. That if the work is going to, the work should not have national restrictions. He wrote in French, wrote in English, actually even did a lot of work in German in different ways with translators. And so that universalism is something that the allegorical has offered. And, but as Aquinas, of course, he's right across from us. So, 15 volumes of the Summa Theologica, but allegory was such a common way of reading the Bible. By the time he is coming to these questions, he says, wait, nothing necessary to the eternal redemption of the Christian must be unavailable at the literal level of the Bible, the level at which anybody can understand it. It has to be there for everyone without an education. Or else there's no religion. It has to be, fully accepted the allegory. Right. He has allegorical interpretation, but he's one of the guys who said, we got to claw that back a bit. The literal is important. What is going on here specifically will reveal to any Christian the truth of their deliverance. Okay.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that was probably, honestly, one of the best, definitely my top 3 episodes thus far, so that's...
well, you've only done 16.
I've only done 16, so yeah, it's a very good place to stop, and, thank you so much for all that, bestowing all that knowledge, and, we're definitely gonna have you back again, hopefully. We're definitely gonna invite you over again for Off Bishop Street. So,
but we'll restrict me to an hour.
I will try, as politely as I can. So yeah, that's it, guys. Episode 16 is in the books, and I'll have to look at my planner to see who's up next for, episodes 17, 18, or 19. I know I have a couple of people that are interested, to be on the show in late May or mid-June. It's still nebulous in my mind, so hopefully you guys enjoyed the show, and see you guys next time for more wonderful theological and beyond, theology podcasts in the future.